Thank you, Ashley, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, everybody from the Centre for the lovely invitation to be here. It's such a delight to be with you all. Yeah, it's really interesting being introduced because I started as a participation practitioner 30 years ago now, working with children and young people who have experience of living in care. And about halfway through their journey between then and now, I decided to become something like a more formal researcher, because I really thought that what I'm learning from young people needs to be heard by bigger audiences. But never did I think I would be coming to Ireland and talking about participation when you are doing it so well. So yeah, totally flattered to be here. And I'm here, I think, because I can perhaps help reflect back some of the things that were heard at the conference yesterday, and connect that to some of the things that some other children across Europe have told me. All right. When I came in earlier, I said thanks to the sound guys for doing such an amazing job. Yeah, and they're doing it right here, right now. Thank you. Yeah. And I'll try not to move too much, but I did explain that my eyesight's not brilliant, so I will also be doing a lot of this to try to make sure that I'm using the right part of my glasses to read what's on the screen. There's a lot that I have learned from young people over the years, and there's a lot that I think you are learning, I'm sure. And I wondered if we might start with some reflection on that. And think, okay, so where do we start? Let's spend this time reflecting together, because there have been some amazing successes. There's, okay, so already yesterday in those sessions we heard about young people's activism, their participation, the things that in the main plenary sessions, in the breakout sessions, we heard about the amazing things that young people are doing, and that's underpinned by amazing structures here in Ireland. You have the strategy, you have Laura's work, which is spread out across Europe and beyond, and all your practice networks. You have all the things that you are doing to bring about change. And I'm lucky to be in a position at the moment where I'm working for the Council of Europe, and we're looking across Europe to ask, okay, so how is participation actually happening in practice? Well, what's it getting written into? Where is it changing laws? And what do children say about that? I can't tell you the results yet, but I'm just letting you know that we're doing that. But already people are talking about Ireland a lot. So, many people in this room have a lot to be proud of. But yesterday we also heard about some of the challenges, I think, and some of the challenges are that there are really deep economic and social inequalities, political, regional. There are massive challenges. And in those contexts, sometimes young people have talked about struggling to feel hopeful, struggling to feel like they're going to get a job, and some children are feeling amazingly happy, and some children that I'm working with at the moment are happy, but sometimes really struggling to have enough to eat. So these are massive issues that we need to deal with. And so, it's just as well you're all so fantastic, and that we are here together thinking about it, because that is the challenge, isn't it? How do we think together about how to change these things? Because what are those inequalities? Well, there's a huge amount of wealth concentrated in the hands of very few people. So 56,000 people have 4 times the amount of wealth as half the population of the world. Those same people produce 4 times the pollution as half of the world. There's inequity in the amount of tax that they pay. So, people who are earning less are paying high percentages of tax. These are the political challenges that we have to deal with. And young people yesterday were saying, well, we need to get political. We need to think about these things, because we need to say things in a way which will actually get to the root of some of this. And it's not just about wealth, is it? It's all the other intersecting inequalities. And the additional pressures of, AI, and what that means in terms of changing economies and perhaps fewer job prospects. And, you know, I don't need to go on to it. Okay. Right. So yesterday, we had this wonderful example of, okay, there's this 4-question test on power that Raphael told us about. You know. Are children and young people always making the decisions in their participatory processes? Sometimes they are, and sometimes it's no's. The panel here talked about getting your feet under the table of power. Is that happening? Well, you know, quite often there are no young feet under that table. So we need to think about how to change those things. And before yesterday, I prepared sort of this idea of transformative participation as something that we're aiming for. You know, where we really challenge those injustices, and that we really think about, well, how do we get power into that? And it does feel really hard. It does feel like pushing a rock up Diamond Hill. You know, it is that up the steep route. You know, it is that hard, isn't it? You know. But it doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be trying to do it. And there are 4 things that have really helped me try to think about doing that. One is to think about agency. One is to think about context, think about reciprocity, and think about time. There's probably 20 other things that help me to think about, but these are the things that struck me. You know. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about agency. And then I'll talk about as much as I can about the others, depending on when I get the 10-minute warning from over here. When I do that, I'm going to tell you a story, because everything that I ever do is based on what I've heard from children and young people. So I love social theory because I think it helps me understand what they've said to me, and it helps me put it in a bigger context sometimes. But it is always really grounded in what young people and the amazing allies who work with them have said to me. So I'll tell a bit of a story, and then I'll reflect on a bit of theory and tell you why I think it's helpful. Okay? We'll see how many times we can do that. But the first time that we do it, attending to agency, I deleted the story that I had here because I thought you might want to reflect on yours, especially in the light of what we heard yesterday. So we can do this in a really participatory way if you want to stand up, yeah, or put your hand in the air. But, you know, these are questions to you. Have children or young people ever told you, or if you're a young person, have you ever thought differently about goals as a result of engaging in participation activities? Has anybody put their hand up? Yeah? So how about, have young people ever told you about taking on new roles through their participation activities? Yeah? Yeah, loads of hands in the air. And we heard a lot of that yesterday, didn't we? Have young people ever told you about their participation activities helping them deal with the challenging circumstances in their own lives? I see, oh look, lots of nods still. This is really amazing, isn't it? Because this is what you are all working to achieve. This is all the differences that you're making. And how about have children or young people told you about activities that have enabled them to get organised with other people, set agendas for change that will affect the lives of other people, and then to take control and direct the resources that enable that change to be initiated and sustained? It's some, you know, and this is also what's wonderful, okay? Because it's like, it's not that nobody can say yes. I saw some hands doing this, you know, I don't know if you ever do the hip miss, maybe, you know? You know, it's for some people like this, but for a lot of people, you know, that's not the sort of participation that is being achieved. But I think that's the sort of participation that they were talking about yesterday when they were saying getting your feet under the table of power, you know? Getting your feet under the table of power can mean coming with your agenda and having that heard and making decisions in an intergenerational group, because it's, you know, many of us don't have our feet under the table of power, you know, But so it's not just a generational issue. But I think that is what young people and children want us to be aiming for them in some circumstances. And to, that happens in all sorts of different ways. So agency across that kind of, that way of being in life, it happens as people decide about what they're going to do for themselves. It happens when they decide how they're going to deal with life circumstances, everything that happens right across that continuum is really valuable. Yeah? In a school setting, it might be that children are thinking about taking on the role of becoming a counsellor. They might be organising a disco. But it's, and I heard yesterday about taking part in a national conversation. But it's rare that they get to the point of making the decision about who's getting excluded or how a strategy should be made around that. And to help us think about what our activities are offering young people or what young people are asking for, I went to look in social theory to try and understand, well, what is agency? And has anybody got an explanation of agency that fits with what I'm hearing from young people? And I came across this idea from somebody called Margaret Archer. And she talked about the first stage of agency is reflecting on your experience and deciding on your goals. And that happens at an individual level. The next stage is of being a social actor and taking on your chosen roles. But at the level of a collectivity, you might also be dealing with people who are in a similar life circumstance. You might be dealing with the challenges in a way together, which she calls primary agency. And then some people achieve corporate agency, and they're setting those agendas and getting organised and trying to achieve change. Now, the problem with Margaret Archer, much as I deeply respect what she said none of this applies to children. And so I had to write something that disagreed with that. Because as we've just seen in this room, it all does, doesn't it? But if what they're asking for, if what some young people are asking for is corporate agency, and we know that sometimes there's only excursions into that space, it's really useful for us to think about, well, what are the component parts of that? What brings it together? And it's about getting organised. It's about linking up with other people and having a bit of a strategy for things. That's what, and I think she's right about that, because the more that we connect with each other, and these events are really important for that, the more we understand what might be possible. But even in small interactions, it's possible to make small challenges around this, because you can do the thing that Raphael again talked to me about last night, is decision makers can come in with a blank piece of paper rather than coming in with their own agenda. And then at least young people are getting part of this process, even if they're not going to make all of the decisions all along the way. Or, young people can be in the committees where they're deciding about who's getting the funding, and just be a part of a much longer part of the process. So my point with this concept is all of it is valuable. What we do in the everyday spaces of youth work, of community life, the agency that children are experiencing there is really important. That's really valuable participation. And where it's possible, it's also really good to push towards the end of corporate agency. So to do that, I think, it helps us value where the everyday spaces in which children are participating. It helps us value how they can offer a safe space for challenging and dealing with oppression. But reflecting on that idea of agency can help us also think about, well, what are we inviting children into? Are we inviting children into something where they've got an opportunity to lead, or where they're labouring for somebody else's agenda? And wherever possible, we can start to seek opportunities for them to get their feet under the table. Or, if they're not under the table, maybe seek, support their activism but I'll come on to that again in a minute. So when I'm working with young people, which I'm doing in a really regular way every week, I'm still working with young people in all sorts of groups where they're trying to bring about change. I find it useful to have these heads in my head of, what agency are they exercising? And what do they need in order to achieve their goals? Because, they might need any of that or all of it. And then how could I support with that? Okay, concept 1 done, tick. Let's move on. And I thought I could move on to context next. This is a beautiful story, and I won't read it all, but this is a story from a young man who's in kinship care. And I spent a long time with him and a friend. We did all these really playful activities, took over a whole church, actually, decorated it with things. And then at the end, he was telling me about his life with objects. And I said, okay, at the end, can you tell that to me as a story? What should be happening for children based on your experience? And this is what he talked about. He's talking about being with family. He's talking about people helping him, family and teachers helping him with problems. And how your confidence can develop or not. I find it a really beautiful story, and it's the sort of experience that I would want children in care to experience consistently. Unfortunately, when I took that story back to the group of care experienced young people who were doing the co-research with me, most of them didn't have anything like that in their experience. We talked about the differences in young people's experiences. And we started to talk about the things that aren't in those words and the things that weren't in the words of the other children and young people we talked to. What was behind that? The context that's behind that. And they talked about, the assumptions that people have about families and who can be in a caring role. And how they could be supported or not. And working with them over 3 weeks, we were able to get to a bit of that context of what's happening right now that are the limitations. And we presented these results into a report, which then informed the national guidance in the UK about working with looked after children, the NICE guidance. So it felt like, they had somewhere to go, and their context, which was different from this story, was heard. And I think the story I'm telling you now is important because we don't always get that opportunity to have those conversations to contextualize what we're hearing. Sometimes we have to deliver reports about participation and consultation activities really quickly. And we don't have the time to think about, well, what are all the barriers? What are the differences? What are the nuances? What are the causes behind any of this? So I found it really useful to bring in this question of context all the time, to think about, okay, what is set around this? And my point to bring in the theory is, if you don't do that, you can have somebody standing outside the process who's looking in at it, who will do something which Bourdieu calls symbolic violence, They will read what you have written, and what young people have said from the basis of these really dominant assumptions about people. We are almost everybody that we engage with, and us ourselves, we're full of the kind of these dominant ideas about who is competent to do different things. So the more we can put context in, the more it helps challenge that. But it also helps young people challenge it, because they also have heard all of those dominant assumptions, and they can feel like this is framing, who they are, and that their experience of not being in kinship care is something to do with their fault, or something that is normal, when it's not, So, and the other the person who's helped me do that with young people is Frere, because, you know, he helps you think about, like, working over time, critically reflecting, you know, with young people that can help them unpick those dominant assumptions about those lives, their lives that have been put upon them. And again, there's questions for reflection that are really useful in those contexts, you know, because it's helpful to stop and think, who may interpret or misinterpret? And what might they ignore about what these children are trying to say? And how can we do that? By, you know, reframing what young people have said, by providing powerful accounts of context. Okay, 10 minutes, 2 concepts. Here we go. Let's do it. Reciprocity. You know, that's about, for me, it's about giving and taking. In this example, right, of young people in a city in Europe, that what they did is they organised an event in the park with a local organisation, and they were meant to be developing recommendations on health promotion, but the children in this community had no idea what health promotion was. They'd never really had a chance to take part in any group activity at all. So the organisation created a health gymkhana, so you could go around in activities in the park and try things out to see whether you liked it or not. They tried things out. They really liked doing kickboxing, so kickboxing was organised for them for the next 12 weeks. And at the end of those sessions, they talked about health, and those ideas about health were gathered and shared with people. And it was brilliant because, you know, it was a participatory voice activity, but it was voice really embedded in experience. And so they got to learn and understand and think about things that they wouldn't have had the chance to think about and say if they hadn't had that experience. But none of that is the point of this story. The point of this story is, who is making any of this possible? The families were doing, and the community groups were doing loads to make this possible, even to the extent of going up the mountain and getting a Christmas tree and bringing it back so that the children could put their wishes about future health hung on the Christmas tree. In other parts of this city, there were Christmas trees, but not in this community, because this community wasn't worthy of having a Christmas tree. You know? And yet they were still really giving. And even when somebody from the mayor's office came along to listen, you know, still no money, no support from the mayor, at least not initially. And it's a private donor who came in and said, okay, so I will give you some money to make those wishes come true. So for me, it's really important that we think about what is being contributed through which interactions. You know, who is giving what into this? And to recognise the role of families stopped us imposing a global minority view of individualised children. You know, the children we work with are part of communities, part of families. You know? And it also challenges us. It helps us think about, well, what else might we push for? Because a lot of the time, children and communities are made responsible for finding their own solutions. And in something that I call, and others call, neoliberal citizenship. You know, they're left to find the answers themselves. They give them the duty of putting their rights into practice. But I think what we're trying to achieve is something more like social citizenship. You know, where there's some kind of give and take. There's some reciprocity from the state, as well as from communities. And looking at who's giving and what, who's giving what and who's getting what, I think helps us bring more of the politics into this. And it helps, I think, you know, when budgets are really strapped, it's not just blue sky thinking, you know, but when local authority budgets are really small, it really helps, in my experience, to show what people are already giving into this, because it's not always recognised, you know. And then I think that can also open some of the hearts that need to be opened in order for the purses to be opened as well. And then, if once you've done all of that, then change is still not happening, it can also help young people opt into other ways of being political. Okay, so they've tried all of that. So what else do we need to do? We can show who's giving what, and who's still not getting what, So how else can we be activist citizens? And not just young people, because sometimes we as their allies need to do that as well. Okay, final concept. Oh no, let me just give you the two questions that are useful for reflection. Who's giving and who's getting what? And who else has the power to give or share? What forms of reciprocity and citizenship will help trigger that? Final concept, and I have more than 2 minutes because that sign's not come up yet, and we're going to talk about time, right? So time, it's massive, isn't it? Time is behind everything. Continue over time, right? So these three young men talked about the difficulties in their community and the problems for them for staying out of trouble. They weren't young people who were, I've worked with young people in youth justice settings, and these weren't those young people, but they were talking anyway about the difficulties of staying out of trouble. Every day it's a challenge. And, Basia said that, and Basim said, I don't want my kids to go through what I went through. This is a really close community, but it's just not very positive because many people are not doing well. Basia replied, well, people have not been doing well for at least the last 25 years, last 30 years, last 40 years, Some of the challenges that we looked at the beginning are really, really long term. And then we're asking young people to think about a solution today that will make things better, either for them individually to stay out of trouble or for things in their community to be better. So bringing in this notion of time that they talk about there is really, I think it's really reassuring for young people because it helps think about the fact that we are dealing with really long-term problems. Because very often, when you talk to somebody, they talk about something that's happening now, but they're describing things that happened in the past. And underneath that, they've got hopes for the future, but underneath it all, sorry, the animation doesn't work. Underneath it all are really, really long-term problems. So that's one way of thinking about time. The other way of thinking about time is this from an extra story. Well, 550 young Roma young people who tried to distill advice for other people doing participatory action research into 10 words. Actually, it's 11. But, you must work together. Change can happen, but it does take time, And for them giving each other that message that it takes time was so reassuring. And we're doing that all the time, aren't we? And we're thinking, we are trying to help the young people that we're working with, I think, decide where to pitch their ambitions and whether to ask for the things that are long-term goals, perhaps, or go for the short-term gains, But talking about that time, I think, is really useful because it helps them prioritize. And sometimes they choose to go for the really big political things, that challenge those underlying conditions, even if they know that maybe they're not going there. So I think in the time available, I've just managed to do all of those, and I can cut to the last two questions for reflection. So, what, and this is the political bit, isn't it? It's like, what are the powers? What are the causes of these ongoing inequities, that children and young people are facing? And what individual and collective agency can we bring together, and the reciprocity into that to combine and transform these over time? And I was asked for one message, so that's the black bit here, build an ecosystem of participation. And that's what we're doing here, I think, And it's also what I've been doing with colleagues in Barcelona, where they've been looking at ways for all the people doing participation with all the marginalised groups and all the mainstream groups in that area to come together, to share what they are learning about what opens the doors of power, and what are, what ways of working together that works, The more that we work together as an ecosystem, and the more that we actually reflect on power within this, there's a chance that we can act together in ways that will bring transformative change. Thank you very much.